What was the first astrology book you ever read?
The first astrology book I ever read was a long time in my childhood life after I got into astrology, and this is a true story. There was a Perry Como song called Catch a Falling Star and Put It in Your Pocket. It was my first earworm. I was about 4 years old, and I thought stars fell from the sky. And I used to think every morning when I went to school, I just started school, I think I'll find a star on the pavement because it would have fallen from the sky. And I thought stars were about 6 inches from side to side, and made out of gold cardboard because that's what children do. And I never found one. And so, being a critical thinker, and even at that age, I thought, well, I need to get up earlier because clearly the fact there aren't any stars on the pavement means the street sweepers have been out and swept them away. So tomorrow I'll get up earlier, but I never managed to get up earlier. I never found the star. But that really, that's the origin of my love of the stars, my fascination for them. The first astrology book I ever read or ever bought, I was probably about 17. And again, a different era. It was a time when you couldn't just click on Amazon, buy any book you want.
Yeah,
You had to find books in secondhand bookshops.
it was like a real hunt.
Yeah, so it was Rupert Gleadow's Origins of the Zodiac, which was published in 1969. And Gleadow was a general writer who had a big interest in astrology. So he wrote on other topics as well. So I would have bought this probably in 1970 when it was fresh off the printing press. And I bought it in a second-hand shop in Cambridge. That's Cambridge, England. And it was an interesting book 'cause it's partly historical. And so that's the first time I read about the history of astrology, which has become my great passion. But it also included little bits of astrological interpretation. So it wasn't just the history. This person published this book then and did that next year. It was, and this is how they thought of this zodiac, the zodiac signs, for example. So I got a little bit of the meaning of astrology there as well. But that was the moment. I can remember the smell of the secondhand bookshop. Those wonderful, musty, dusty,
Wow.
old environments.
So history was with you from the beginning.
Well, I got into history and mythology. I'll tell you the story. I was 7 years old, sitting in my junior school. And so this would have been about 1959 or 60. And into the classroom, they wheeled this big radio, huge thing on wheels. And they played us this program, which was a reading of a chapter from a book on the myths of ancient Greece and Rome. And I can remember the world at that moment became multi-dimensional. I went off to the library, I found the book, I read it cover to cover in an afternoon, and I never looked back. And that's so astrology, history, and mythology came together
Yeah.
by then. And that they've become the things I love. Like as a historian, I always want to think about how do we get to where we are now? Where
Yeah.
we are now is one thing, but how do we get here? And so that occupies my brain, my entire waking hours.
Well, you were one of the first, maybe not the first, but at least in a movement of astrologers going back to graduate school to get doctorates and
Uh,
to enter the academy and do a lot of amazing things in changing academia's understanding of astrology.
I actually think the first person in this movement was probably Patrick Curry, who went in the early 80s to study at London University and wrote his PhD on 17th century astrology and for the reasons for its decline in England. And so Patrick was unusual because he also had studied and practiced astrology. And until that point, you'd get historians who would say, well, what is this weird thing? And they'd slightly treat it at arm's length. And they were either impartial but thought, look, this is a strange thing, the occult, and it's all now died out. Or they just say, this is really stupid. Somehow it's part of history, so let's hold our noses while we write about it. And Patrick was the first historian I know of who had studied and practiced astrology and who freed the history of astrology from this need to be judgmental.
Hmm.
And then I didn't start my PhD until a good 12 years after he got his. And I wasn't the absolute first to do a PhD on contemporary astrology, but if I wasn't the first, I was about the second. And now there's about a dozen, about half of which I've supervised. It's one thing, some historians can look at medieval astrology and say, okay, we're used to that. It was okay back then.
Mhm.
But how on earth do people still believe this stuff? Which is a daft question because, first of all, people believe all sorts of things, which are weird, if you want to use that word. And secondly, astrology is not just a belief, it's something people do, it's a
Mhm.
practice. So we've broken through that taboo on writing PhDs on contemporary astrology and talking to astrologers and allowing them to speak in their own words, which everybody else is allowed to do, and say, look, what is your interest? What do you do? How do you feel about this? All students have a chance to do that, to go out and talk to 4 or 5 astrologers, some interview them,
Yeah.
and say, look, tell me about what you do. How do you feel about astrology? Because as we know, astrology doesn't exist as only one thing. There's major different schools of astrology,
Mhm.
some of which are almost like incompatible with each other. And there are some astrologers who regard what other astrologers do as not proper astrology. We bring all these things together. There's a rich cultural landscape as a result.
Yeah, and your program
And
allows people to get into the non-text, the sort of living text of doing the
yeah,
practice, whereas the transmission of the history of it only can live in texts because those
yeah,
people are not with us anymore.
texts from the past, yeah, and oral transmission now. But the texts we look at as well, because if you're learning astrology, you'll look at a text you learn from a book, and it says, and if you've got a Mars Saturn square, you'll be like this, right? So what my interest is and what I try to teach is what's really being said there. That when you were born, Mars in zodiacal longitude was approximately 90 degrees from Saturn. And so you were like this. What on earth are you saying? What are you really saying about the nature of time, the nature of space, the nature of psychic reality, the nature of psychology, the nature of everything, actually? What's being said here?
Mhm.
And it's often, so astrology is often treated this very mundane way. Oh, you've got a Venus Uranus conjunction, so you like unusual relationships. Hang on a minute. Stop. Let's unpack this for a minute. What?
Yeah,
I mean,
it's like, is this star really falling down to the
you know,
pavement, or have the street sweepers come
exactly,
before us?
exactly.
Yeah, gotta get
So
that
there's a whole
skeptical.
thing that practice there to unpack that is a major part of modern culture,
Mhm.
much as some people wish it wasn't,
Yeah.
but it is.